In the Form Behaviours section, there is a tutorial on checking for mandatory fields using the Check Mandatory Behaviour command. Whilst that is often the best option for mandatory fields, especially in multiple page forms, there is another method that allows you to set fields as mandatory at specific stages of the form and for particular users of the form. It's important to be aware that this method can only be used after the workflow logic and user roles have been completed. These topics are covered in separate tutorials. When working with mandatory fields, it's worth ensuring that you have the Object Markers option turned on. This will display a marker when a field is selected as mandatory. To turn this option on, go to the View menu. In Layout mode, open the page that you want to work with. In the State and Mandatory section on the left, notice the drop-downs that include all of the stages and roles defined for the form. Some fields may well be mandatory at all times and for all users. For these fields, simply leave the stage and role combination to all, and for each of the fields, mark them as mandatory in the object properties. Objects don't have to be selected individually. Select objects in groups using your Control key and you will see that the mandatory checkbox is common to all. On the claim page, the reference and table would also be mandatory at all times. The total field will be calculated rather than completed by any user, so this doesn't need to be included. On the Approvals page, we might want to set the fields to be mandatory at specific stage and role combinations. For example, the Manager Decision field would only need to be mandatory at the Manager Decision stage and only if the manager is viewing the form. In this scenario, you can select the appropriate stage and role combination on the left and then set the field to be mandatory. A similar setting can be made for the Department Head Decision field. We can use different combination of methods to manage mandatory fields, and in this example I would specify that the comments fields are only mandatory if the manager or department head denies the request. This type of conditional mandatory logic could only be achieved using the Check Mandatory Behaviour command. Whilst that has completed the settings for this example form, do be aware that there is an overview option available should you wish to see which fields are mandatory in a list view. Click on the View Mandatory link at the bottom. A dialog box will open and you can choose the stage and role combination to see which fields on the form are or are not mandatory. Finally, an important note for you. Using the mandatory check option in the object properties, as demonstrated in this tutorial, may well be appropriate in some forms, but it's important to understand that the field will only be checked as mandatory when the form is submitted. In a multiple page form, this might not be user friendly if the mandatory fields are not on the same page as the submit button. In some forms it may well be more appropriate to use the check mandatory behaviour, which can be triggered when a user is moving from one page to another.